let us start. This is the remaining part of my last lecture, meningitis, because I had told in last lecture also the meningitis is vague, and this consists of the different types of the meningitis depending upon the causes. And so just the recapitulation of the causes of meningitis, which we discussed in the last lecture. The broadly is divided into the infective and non-infective causes. Under the infective causes, the bacteria, virus, protozoa, and parasites, fungus, and under the non-infective, which is also called the sterile form of the meningitis, malignant diseases and inflammatory diseases. So this much we had discussed in the last lecture, and out of that we discussed the bacterial meningitis in last class, because I told you that this is very common and the frequently encountered in clinical practice, and if it is not diagnosed on time and it's not treated properly, then the mortality is very high as up to the 80%. This was discussed in the last lectures. So this is the continuation of the last lecture. Now today, the next important cause of meningitis, that is the virus. We call it the viral meningitis, that I will discuss today. Under the viral causes, the different types of the viruses. The most common viruses, they are the enteroviruses, which includes the ecovirus, Coxsackie virus, and poliovirus, mumps virus, influenza, herpes simplex, varicella zoster, and Epstein-Barr virus, and lastly HIV virus. So these are the common virus, but beyond this also there are some rare causes of the virus which I have not included here, and so these are the causes which you should know, and which you will see once you are posted to the clinical ward. And beside virus, there are other causes of meningitis, like we talked bacterial cause, viral cause. Now come to the protozoa and a parasite. Under the protozoa and a parasite, the common this protozoa and the parasites, they are the Cysticercae and the amoeba. And then next is the fungi, and under the fungi, Cryptococcus neoformans, according to the order is in the top of the list, and the Candida histoplasma, Blastomyces, and Coccidioides, Sporothrix. So these are the list of some of the common types of fungus. They are found to be responsible for fungal meningitis. And beside this also, there are other fungus which I have not included here. And the next cause or heading of causes of meningitis was the non-infective cause. There is no infection, but there is meningitis. Under the non-infective cause, the malignant diseases and inflammatory diseases, they are important. And under the malignant disease, the breast cancer, bronchial cancer, leukemia, and lymphoma. So these are some of the common types of malignant diseases which are associated with meningitis. And the inflammatory diseases, this includes the sarcoidosis, systemic lupus erythematosus, and Behçet's disease. So these are the connective tissue diseases, and both the malignant disease as well as the inflammatory disease, they produce the meningitis, and this meningitis is usually sterile, because you will not see any organism when you see yourself from this category of the patients. That is why the meningitis produced by the malignant diseases, produced or associated with the malignant disease or inflammatory diseases, is usually sterile. So that is why it is also called the aseptic or sterile form of the meningitis. So after this, let us talk about the viral meningitis. Causes, they are already mentioned, and these are the most common cause of the meningitis. The name of the virus is already mentioned in the previous slide, and they usually produce the benign form of the meningitis. So most of the time it limits on its own, so it does not need any intervention. This is the beauty of these types of the meningitis. Whereas the bacterial meningitis is very aggressive and the patient presents very seriously. it is less serious than the bacterial meningitis, unless it is associated with the encephalitis, because encephalitis in milder form or in early stage may have the presentation like that of the viral meningitis. If it is the encephalitis, then the situation is more serious than the viral meningitis. Most common viruses which are causing the meningitis, they are the enteroviruses. Out of other viruses, enteroviruses, they are the like Coxsackie, ecoviruses, they are the common. And then next is the mumps virus. This is also the common cause of the next common cause of the viral meningitis. Though there are other viruses in the list, but under the common viruses responsible for meningitis, we have to mention the enteroviruses and the this mumps virus. Now the clinical features of the viral meningitis, how do they present to you? Usually it occurs in the children and the young adults. They will complain of the headache, which is usually acute in onset, and this is like irritability type. It will be patient will feel irritation after the headache, and the rapid development of the meningism, and there may be high fever, but usually high fever is very specific to the bacterial meningitis or pyogenic meningitis. And the focal neurological signs, they are rare. Usually you will not get here because you may see in like pyogenic as well as even in the tuberculosis, but in viral meningitis, the focal neurological signs or deficits, they are rare. Now, how to investigate? Again, if I say how to diagnose, then you have to say history taking and examination and then investigation. Now, if you directly go to the investigation, then you can start from the lumbar puncture. But before lumbar puncture is the single most diagnostic test for meningitis. That is why here also it is mentioned the lumbar puncture. But before lumbar puncture, you will be evaluating the patient and you will be sending some routine tests like CBC, and if the fever is also high, then blood culture, urine routine. These are the routine basic tests which you have to send in any patient presenting with the fever. And after doing the lumbar puncture and regarding the contraindication for the lumbar puncture, if there is no any contraindication, then you should go for the lumbar puncture, and then after lumbar puncture you will obtain the cerebrospinal fluid. And if you look at this CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, and you can see that the lymphocytes, they are in excess, whereas in bacterial meningitis, neutrophils will be present in excess, and the glucose level will be normal here, but there in bacteria it will be low, and the protein levels, it will be normal. Actually, in most of the cases, it remains normal, but in bacterial meningitis, it remains high. And you should be sure that the patient is not taking antibiotic prior to the lumbar puncture, because the CSF lymphocytosis is found in patients with bacterial meningitis who are treated partially. So this is also very important. Before commenting on the CSF picture, you should take history from the patient that whether the patient was taking antibiotic prior to the lumbar puncture or not. That is very important. Otherwise, the result of the CSF will be confusing. Now, the next is to manage the viral meningitis. I have already mentioned in the previous slide also that it's usually benign and self-limiting. If it is so, it usually does not require any treatment, and in fact, there is no specific treatment for this. So the treatment will be symptomatic. That means you have to treat it symptomatically. For example, if there is a fever, say for example 100 and above degree Fahrenheit, then you should treat with the paracetamol for the fever as per requirement. And if the patient is having the headache, then that headache should also be treated with the paracetamol. And the recovery usually occurs within days, not more than 7 days. Usually within 1 week, majority of the viral infection should recover, unless it is occurring in a special situation like immunosuppressed background. It may occur as a complication of the systemic viral infection like measles and mumps. These meningitis is associated as a complication of the measles and mumps, and complete recovery without specific therapy is the rule. So if it is the pure viral meningitis in a person not having the associated comorbidity, recovery is usual. Recovery is the rule. Now, after the viral meningitis, and let us talk about the tuberculous meningitis. So this is more important than the viral meningitis. After bacterial meningitis, the viral meningitis, tuberculous meningitis is very important. You know, the tuberculosis is still common. Initially, it was said that it is common in the developing country. Nowadays, this is just reverse, that it is even more common in the developed country. They say that it's not common here, but yes, this is common because of the after the discovery and then after the prevalence of the HIV infection in Western community and other immunosuppressed diseases. So this is in fact more common in the developed than in the developing countries. And as the tuberculosis is common, and then its complications, they are also common, because once the tuberculosis is diagnosed, then the patient have to take medicine for a long time, and the rate of treatment failure, treatment defaulter is high, and because of that also the patients, they develop the different complications during the treatment of the tuberculosis. It is still seen in the developing countries and in endemic areas, and it is seen more frequently as a secondary infection in the patients, especially in patients with AIDS, because the primary infection of the meninges by tubercle bacilli is almost rare. It is usually secondary. The patient may have the primary focus in the lung, and if it is not treated properly or if it is treated late, then it will become severe and it will disseminate, and it will take the form of the miliary tuberculosis, that is spreading throughout the body. So during the course of this form of the tuberculosis, and the meninges may also be involved. Otherwise, the primary infection by this Mycobacterium tubercle in the meninges is almost rare. This is still now, it is secondary to the primary focus somewhere in the body. So briefly about the pathophysiology. It occurs shortly after the primary infection in the childhood or as a part of the miliary tuberculosis. It is already mentioned. And if you look at the brain of a patient with the tuberculous meningitis, it is covered by the greenish and the gelatinous exudate, especially around the base of the skull. And you can see numerous scattered tubercles over the meninges. If you are asked what is the essential lesion of tuberculosis, or what is the pathognomonic sign of tuberculosis, then you have to say tubercle. And you have to describe the composition of the tubercle, wherever may be it, maybe in the brain, maybe in the bone, maybe in the kidney, wherever. So if you are asked what is the pathophysiology or what is the essential lesion of the tuberculosis, then you must always tell that the tubercle is the essential lesion or the pathognomonic sign of the tuberculosis, wherever may be the tuberculosis. Then if you are asked describe the pathology of the tuberculosis or pathogenesis of tuberculosis in the meninges, then you have to start with the formation of the tubercle. So that is the answer, and that is the essential lesion. So tubercle in the meninges is the sign of tuberculosis of the meningitis. Now the symptoms, clinical features. How do the patient with tuberculous meningitis presents to you? Headache again, because there is involvement of the meninges, and there may be increased intracranial pressure, and the patient will complain of the headache, and the fever will be of low grade, which is typically seen in a patient with tuberculosis. Sometimes it may rise in the evening, and there may be associated vomiting, lassitude, depression, behavior change, as well as the delirium. These are the some of the common form of the presentation which are made by the patient. And if you examine these patients, and you may find meningism, but it's not very common as it is in the bacterial meningitis. And the papilloedema you may see, so this is secondary to the increased intracranial pressure. And the focal hemisphere sign, sometimes you may see, depending upon which hemisphere is involved, that will show the signs of involvement of the particular area. And oculomotor pulses, they may be seen, and there will be depression in the consciousness level. Initially, there may be altered consciousness, and then in advanced stage, there may be depression of the level of consciousness. So as compared to tuberculous pyogenic meningitis, these focal neurological signs, they are more here, and then they persist. If they are not treated in time, the patient may have the sequelae after the tuberculous meningitis. So this is showing the staging of the severity of the tuberculous meningitis. So there are the 3 stages. You can stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, depending upon the its seriousness. Stage 1 is early stage, where the non-specific symptoms and the signs without alteration of consciousness. Here the consciousness level will be mainly based on the level of consciousness and neurological deficit, and the consciousness level will be okay, and the other non-specific symptoms like headache, fever, malaise will be present in all the stages. That is called the stage 1. Whereas in stage 2, this is considered the intermediate form or intermediate group. Here the consciousness will be altered, but the patient will not be in coma or delirium, and you may see the minor focal neurological sign. In stage 3, which is called the advanced stage, here you can see the stupor or coma, and you may see some severe neurological deficit, and the patient will present with the seizures or the abnormal movement of the body. So these are the 3 stages of the stages of severity of the tuberculous meningitis. Now let us talk about the clinical features of tuberculous meningitis. Usually its onset is slow. It's called the slow onset or insidious onset. You may find like this in the book. And it usually takes 2 to 8 weeks to develop the symptoms. You may get the history of the primary focus somewhere in the body. Patient may give the history of the pulmonary tuberculosis in the past. If it is not treated, it is fatal. You saw the different stages of the severity, and the recovers completely if treatment is started at stage 1. That is stage 1. If you can pick up the patient in the early stage, stage 1 means where the sensorium is also intact and the presentation is very non-specific. So if you diagnose the patient at that stage and if you start the treatment at that stage, then the complete recovery is possible. So if you get the patient in the advanced stage means the patient will have some focal neurological deficit and which may persist, and the recovery may not be complete. There will be partial recovery of the patient. If the treatment is started later, the rate of death or serious neural deficit may occur in about 30%. See, this is very high. So early treatment is very important. If you do not treat in time, if the patient does not come, or if it is not treated in time, then the chances of developing the complications is more. Now the investigation. Once the tuberculosis diagnosis of the tuberculous meningitis is suspected, then you have to perform the lumbar puncture if there is no contraindication. The contraindication means actually, I am repeating repeatedly, the first thing, as you will be puncturing at the spinal cord at the back, so there should not be any infection at the back. That is very important. The puncturing area must be clean. It must not contain any evidence. There must be no any evidence of the infection. And at the same time, patient must not have the signs of raised intracranial pressure. So these 2 things are very important, and patient must be cooperative except the unconscious patient. So these are some of the contraindications for lumbar puncture. If these things are not then you can proceed for the lumbar puncture. And during procedure or after obtaining the CSF, what finding will be there? Like CSF pressure is high. This you can observe during the lumbar puncture, and the color will be clear. But if you allow it to stand, a fine clot will be formed. This is called the spider web. So remember, this is very important. This looks like a spider, spider web of the spider. It looks like. So after receiving the CSF, then keep it in a vial, transparent vial. And if you keep it in the vial, say for 24 hours, next day you can see that there is a formation of spider web. So that is very much diagnostic of tuberculous meningitis. You will not see this in any other form of the tuberculous meningitis. So this we must know, and they do not forget, only by seeing this appearance you may be able to comment or make the diagnosis of this. And on the other hand, if you look at the CSF cytology, it will show the predominant lymphocytes. Lymphocytes will be predominant here as well as in the this viral meningitis, but neutrophil will be predominant in the bacterial meningitis. So it can contain neutrophil. It may contain, actually neutrophil is not a specific findings for the tuberculous meningitis. Lymphocyte is the predominant finding, is the important finding. And if the lymphocytes and neutrophil both are present, then the lymphocyte will definitely predominate the neutrophils. Then it must be at the high as compared to the neutrophil count. And if you look at the protein, it is raised. Here also raised, as well as in the bacterial meningitis also it is raised. And glucose will be decreased, markedly decreased. This is very important. See, glucose decrease is very significant here. And tubercle bacilli, it may be detected in a smear of the centrifuge deposit from the CSF. So take the CSF and centrifuge it, and then if you take the deposit of the centrifuge specimen, and then the subject for the smear for tuberculosis, it may be positive. But negative results does not exclude the diagnosis. Always you may not get, many factors are there. And CSF should be cultured. You can say it's cultured, but the unprecedented part is it takes the 6 weeks for the result. But this is the traditional method, but the newer technique, you can obtain the result earlier than this also. Now, brain imaging, this is very important. Brain imaging, I mean to say here, that means you are subjecting the patient for the CT scan or MRI. Brain imaging means not X-ray. So it will show the hydrocephalus, and it may show the brisk meningeal enhancement on the enhanced CT or the MRI and the intracranial tuberculoma. You can see, if you see the intracranial tuberculoma, this is the diagnosis of tuberculous meningitis. Now come to the management. Once the diagnosis is made or strongly suspected, then you must start the chemotherapy. The regimen, it should not only should, but must include the pyrazinamide. Remember that the tuberculous meningitis, you will be treating with the anti-tubercular medicine, but that regimen must include pyrazinamide, because the just not including the pyrazinamide, or even without the pyrazinamide also, you have got tuberculosis regimen, but it is emphasized on the pyrazinamide. Pyrazinamide must be included here. The reason it may be because its penetration and its availability in the cerebrospinal fluid is very high as compared to the other antituberculous. That should be the reason. That is why it is a mandatory. So tuberculosis regimen without pyrazinamide is incomplete treatment of tuberculosis meningitis. Now the treatment of new tuberculosis, that means according to the WHO guidelines, as you know by this time, I am showing in the next slide. Once you suspect tuberculosis, remember that, because the tuberculosis, it may occur in any part of the body except in few areas that you must know. And then, so once it is diagnosed or suspected tuberculosis, then you have to start the anti-tubercular treatment. And the principle is same, like you will be starting in the intensive phase and as well as in the continuation phase. Actually, this is the treatment tuberculosis. This is the standard regimen I am telling, because in resistant case is different, the MDR case is different, the XDR case is different. So that is why, and even in the skeletal tuberculosis and in renal tuberculosis, some duration is different, composition is different. But I am talking about the standard regimen of the tuberculosis recommended by WHO. That is for the simple or clear-cut case of tuberculosis. So understand this way. There are two phases. One is the intensive phase, another is the continuation phase. The intensive phase is of the 2 months, initial 2 months. So what is given in 2 months of initial period or in intensive phase, you have to prescribe HRZE. H for isoniazide, R for rifampicin, and Z for pyrazinamide, and E for ethambutol. So these are the universally accepted abbreviations. So these are accepted, and you can use these abbreviations in answering the questions even in the exam. And rest 4 months you have to give this isoniazide and rifampicin. This is one. And there is another form of the regimen which consists of the HRJE. Here you are adding the ethambutol also. So 4 drops you are giving in the intensive phase, and in continuation phase you are giving the 3 like isoniazide, rifampicin, ethambutol. So where this regimen is recommended, it is especially recommended for the patients from the countries where there is INS resistance, where INS resistance is very high. So in those areas, you have to consider this regimen. Otherwise, in other area, the number 1 regimen, it is recommended. So this you should know. And regarding the antitubercular treatment, you must know the regimen, you must know the primary and the secondary drugs, and you must know the side effects, dose, because they're very common and very important. Now the role of the glucocorticoid, when and the how and when, or whether or not, because if you talk about my time, when I was MBBS student at that time, so that is about 82, 83. This was a mandatory, and we were taught to prescribe invariably, and it was a must area. But now the role of this has also become controversial. What is found that the recent evidence suggests that if it is given early, it improves the mortality and it doesn't improve the focal neurologic damage. We were taught that if you do not start the corticosteroid, we do not prescribe the corticosteroid along with ATT for patients with tuberculosis meningitis, and there will be focal neurologic deficit, there will be damage to the nerve nuclei, all these things. So that is why you must prescribe glucocorticoid. This was the rule, the recommendation in my time. But now the scenario has changed. Now you see here that so it must be given. So these types of recommendation is not there. So it's very doubtful area. Even then, it's better to prescribe instead of not prescribe. If you prescribe, it's good. If you do not prescribe, it is bad. So we are also practicing nowadays in internal medicine. Corticoid is prescribed along with the ATT, whatever is written here. But this you should know, being a medical student, because medical science keeps on changing, the possible changes. That is why you should know what is the rationality behind it. But even then, if you are in doubt, it's better to start. Now, surgical ventricular drainage for obstructive hydrocephalus, because it may be associated with the obstruction to the free flow of the CSF. That will give rise to the hydrocephalus. This can be this type of surgical procedure may also be required and can be recommended. And skilled nursing is essential, especially during the acute phase of the illness. And well hydration and good nutrition, it should be maintained. And along with the medicine, this is very important, especially if you are dealing with a patient with tuberculosis. Malnutrition is very important, it's a very bad aspect. So that is why the nutrition, it must be considered from the very beginning. They must receive the highly nutritious diet. So after this, let us talk about the other forms of the meningitis. Especially, I will not talk in detail about these other forms of the meningitis. There is fungus meningitis, fungal meningitis. Actually, this is it is better to know because sometimes you may be asking the MCQ. That is why, especially cryptococcosis is one of the very important fungus found to be responsible for fungal meningitis, and it is seen in immunosuppressed patient, and it is one of the recognized complications of the HIV infection. So after the HIV infection, so it came into the limelight. Otherwise, before that, it was not very common. And the diagnosing the fungal infection in the clinical practice is another clinical dilemma, which becomes very difficult, and most of the time we have to start the treatment empirically. So CSF finding in fungal meningitis, they are similar to the tuberculous meningitis, so it is easy to remember you. It's better to know same as tuberculous meningitis. So that means the glucose will be very low and the protein will be high, and the cells will be lymphocyte. So just to make it shortcut, is same as the tuberculous meningitis. And the diagnosis is confirmed by either microscopy or special serological test. They are required for making the diagnosis. And if you talk about our situation, still today in our part, diagnosing fungal infection is a big clinical dilemma. It's a very difficult area. Now, beside this, you can see meningitis due to some other non-infective pathologies. For example, this is the systemic lupus erythematosus. I discussed in the previous slide also, Behçet's disease and sarcoidosis. So these are some of the non-infective, and these are some connected diseases which may give rise to the recurrent aseptic meningitis. And meningitis can also be caused by the direct invasion of the meninges by the neoplastic cells that we label as the malignant neoplasm. Once there is the metastasis of these malignant cells, and once they reach to the brain, as you know, different types of the malignant conditions can give rise to metastasis to the brain. Once these neoplastic cells, they reach to the brain, and they may lodge in the meninges, and they will produce the malignant neoplasm. So in these conditions like malignant neoplasm as well as in the sarcoidosis and the SLE, you will not find any organism. So that is why meningitis is there, but there is no organism. So that is why it's called the aseptic meningitis or sterile form of the meningitis. So this is all with this. Thank you very much. And I will